At this time, I'd like to introduce our second speaker for the day, Dr. Margaret Jodlowski. Margaret is the newest hire in the Department of Agriculture, Environmental and Development Economics, starting this past August. She completed her PhD at Cornell University in the Dyson School of Applied Economics and Management in 2020. Prior to studying at Cornell, she received her Master's of Science in Agriculture and Applied Economics from the University of Illinois at Urbana-Champaign. She also attended Illinois as an undergraduate, receiving a Bachelor's of Science in History. Her research focuses on agriculture issues both domestically and internationally, with specific emphasis on farm labor and farm household dynamics. Broadly, her research explores how farms and other agriculture operations impact rural economies and environments, and how those, along with policy changes in those spaces, affect the nature of agriculture production. It's been a real joy to get to know Margaret over the last couple of months, and I believe her to be an excellent addition to our department. Margaret and I have bonded over baseball, where unfortunately her Chicago Cubs are significantly better than my Kansas City Royals, which I don't think took much this year. And with that, making her Ohio agriculture debut, please welcome Dr. Margaret Jodlowski.
Thanks so much, Ben, and thanks for the shout out to my beloved Cubs. So as Ben said, I'm a new hire in the department, and I'm very excited to be here. My presentation today will not be quite so outlooky as some of the others. I'm going to give a sort of sense of one of the things I work on, and one of the areas that I work on that I think will be significantly impacted by COVID-19, and that is off-farm labor or off-farm income. And so what I'll be presenting today is first a sort of overview of my current research on off-farm income, including the motivation and some of my findings, as well as a couple conclusions and next steps. So where I'm going to be taking this research next as I get underway here at The Ohio State University. And then after that, I'm going to do a very quick sort of 5-minute overview of some other issues that relate to COVID-19 and farm labor on the more labor demand side for agricultural operations. And so without further ado, to get started, so my research on off-farm income is really motivated by a desire to understand how off-farm income, the role it plays for farm finances, given what we know to be a couple sort of long-standing trends that have existed over the last 10 to 20 years. And the first and probably most important is an increasing reliance by farm operations on off-farm income. So we know over the last sort of 2 decades that off-farm income has become more and more important for farms in a variety of ways, but more and more farms are seeking off-farm employment or relying on off-farm employment in some way, whether that's to pay down debt or to smooth income, etc. So in addition to that, we also have seen trends related to changing operator demographics. It's not going to be news to anybody in the audience that farmers on average are getting older. So we are seeing sort of implications for that as they maybe exit the off-farm labor force. And so the implications that has for off-farm labor, and then how off-farm, that loss of off-farm income, for example, how that affects farm finances down the road is really, really important. And we're also seeing growing, small certainly, but growing trend towards increased participation of sort of what we would call a non-traditional operator, women or minorities, for example. And so they interact with the labor market differently. And so there's implications for that as well. And then finally, we've known that there's a trend in farmland concentration, and it's important to understand the role off-farm income plays in terms of that trend, whether or not loss of off-farm opportunities accelerate farmland concentration, or whether increased opportunities in the off-farm rural economies can sort of stave off this trend of farmland concentration. And so in addition, it's my goal with this research to describe this place where the farm and non-farm economy intersect. It's one of the primary channels at the farm household or farm operation level where we see these two overlap. And so to give a little sense of what we know already, so we know that off-farm income is sort of credited with closing this gap between the income of a farm household and a non-farm household. So we see that prior to the start of this millennium, that farm households on average had lower incomes, and then that sort of changed at the start of this century. And it's usually ascribed to the fact that more and more off-farm income came into play. And so it's sort of credited with closing this gap. And this trend has only continued to sort of in this way over time. And so we know already that off-farm income is incredibly important. And we also know that it's incredibly important for a certain type of operation. So we know that for farms right here in the middle of the farm size distribution, off-farm income is sort of almost 50-50 in terms of the income, total income received by the farm. So very large farms obviously are earning enough farm income that the off-farm income is sort of just the cherry on top. And on the other side, residential farms are actually losing farm income and so are 100% reliant on their off-farm income. But it's really these farms in the middle, so the farms that are sort of exiting or sort of being absorbed into either side of the farm size distribution. It's really those that we see off-farm income being the most important for. So knowing that, we have a couple of things, more than a couple of things that we don't know, and that's where I hope to sort of fill the gaps. So we don't know the causal impact of non-farm income on farm financial viability. We don't know the extent to which or whether or not off-farm income or changes to off-farm income directly impact farm financial viability in a way that's, you can say, cause and effect, that's not compromised by other aspects of the farm business. And so that's something that's really important for us to understand, given all of the trends and factors that I've just mentioned. In addition, we don't have a clear understanding of how off-farm income factors into an operations risk management strategy. And so we have a couple theories or hypotheses, and you hear a lot of anecdotes, and some of those include it's just income smoothing, which I certainly think holds water. And you also hear, probably most frequently when I talk to operators about this, you hear it's a lot to do with non-wage benefits, primarily health insurance. And so you hear this, but it's never really been validated in any sort of robust way. And so that's something that I hope to achieve here. And we also don't know how this has changed over time. And this is important not only for understanding the past, but also for understanding as we look to the future and as we look to these sort of factors in the world that have changed off-farm opportunities. And especially now, the COVID-19 pandemic has certainly impacted the off-farm economy. And so it's certainly an open question whether or not that's going to trickle back and affect farm operations through this particular channel. And so I'm not going to hit anyone over the head with complicated methods because I do only have a short period of time. But to give a sense of what I do here, I use farm level data from the Agricultural Resource Management Survey, or ARMS, and I use it for the last 2 decades, well, minus a couple of years, of course. So I looked from 1996 to 2016. And along with these really valuable data, what I need is a measure of off-farm work opportunities that change over time and space. And so you can think about in your own lives what a measure like this might be. It might be, for example, growth in service sector jobs, as, for example, rural communities as enrollment in higher education facilities in rural areas grow, that might provide more off-farm work opportunities. Or the opposite, as, for example, rural hospitals close, that might limit off-farm work opportunities. And so there are a host of them, and COVID-19 is certainly the most obvious one right now. Unfortunately, in order for this presentation, obviously do not have the numbers there, but that is something that I hope to incorporate very soon. But instead, what I use is import competition from China. So as we know, over this time period I reference here, China's growth in imports increased very dramatically, and we know that that impacted both manufacturing and industry very directly, but there's also a lot of evidence that it impacted the service sector sort of indirectly. And so this is one measure, and I certainly acknowledge that it is not the only measure, but it is one measure of a way in which the off-farm opportunities changed for a farm operation. And most importantly for me, on the measurement side, it's important because it varies both over time and space. And so what I have here is a measure of this import competition for 1 year. I picked the last year in our survey, 2016, and you can see that it has quite a bit of variance in terms, so a higher number indicates more pressure, more import pressure from increased imports from China, and a lower or lighter number indicates less pressure. And so you can see over the country, there are different levels of impact from this import competition. And so you can imagine a farm in different places around the country are going to be impacted through this specific measure very differently. And so to jump right into my findings, what I find first is that in response to these declining job opportunities through this particular measure, and that's important to keep in mind as we talk about these results, that we see the primary operator, unsurprisingly, loses off-farm income of a value, and the average farm loses about 50% of their average income per week, which is a significant decline, of course, in off-farm income. We see that this is primarily driven by a drop in off-farm hours. So they reduce their off-farm hours and earn less, which certainly makes sense. And their on-farm hours really do not change in response to this. On the other side, we see that the primary operator's spouse, her income off-farm income also declines, but less so, only about 20% of the average income per week. And sort of surprisingly, and in contrast to what we see for the primary operator, her off-farm hours actually increase. So the farm operator spouse, on average, in response to this particular off-farm shock, increases off-farm hours but earns less. And so you can imagine this could indicate a shift towards a lower paying job that requires more hours but isn't actually as compensating quite as much. And the time for these off-farm hours comes from a significant decline in on-farm hours. And so it's important to remember again that this is just in response to one particular shock. It's a pretty narrow shock. It's not going to affect every operation, of course, but these are effects sort of on the average, and they do have important implications for validating what I do next, which is look at the relationship between these off-farm work opportunities and different measures of farm debt. And so in response to declining off-farm job opportunities for the operator, we see increases in short-term farm debt, and to the tune of about $3,000 per 1% increase in import pressure. So if you remember back to that map, different values of import pressure, it doesn't have a neat and tidy explanation, but you can imagine as import pressure grows and grows, the farm debt seems to increase, and it increases at about $3,000 per 1% increase. And the average farm is exposed to about a 10% increase in import pressure year after year. And so you can imagine these numbers aren't huge, of course, but that could indicate that this measure isn't neatly capturing off-farm work opportunities for every operation, but they are significant. And we also see no impact on household debt. So if we look at the farm household's debt separately from the operations debt, we see there's no impact for declining farm opportunities for the farm operator. We see the opposite, however, for the farm spouse. So when the farm spouse's job opportunities are shocked, we see no impact on farm debt, but an increase in farm household debt to the tune of about $2,000 per 1% increase in import pressure. And so it seems to be that there's a really neat separation between the off-farm work of the farm operator and spouse, and it seems to be going in towards different pockets of debt in the farm operation. So some are going towards the operation itself, and some are going towards the farm household. Of course, we have some other findings as well, and those are related to, first, the household debt secured by the farm, and we see that declined significantly as well, which I find very interesting and certainly lends itself to this explanation that the two units of debt, the farm and the operation and the household, are separating, which it sort of reinforces that finding. But of course, we all know, or we all should know, that debt is not necessarily an indicator of financial stress. So in terms of understanding and unpacking whether or not this is actually growth through debt or taking on more land, operating more intensely, new equipment, et cetera, you can imagine 100 different ways this could be growth, debt-related growth. I've started to unpack different measures of farm financial stress as well. And so we do see significant increases in leverage. So a farm's debt to asset ratio does increase significantly when off-farm work opportunities are shocked. And we also see significant decreases in farms' debt repayment capacity utilization, which is a measure of the amount of debt a farm can pay back given their current financial structure. And so it's still initial. This is definitely ongoing work that I'm really excited to share with everyone, but these do seem to point towards the indication, at least, that this is debt that's leading towards increased financial stress. And so as some conclusions for this side of the work, and then I'll quickly jump in to the farm labor demand side, we see that declining off-farm opportunities increases the debt load for the farm operation and the farm household separately. And it's, as I said, still very much work in progress about whether or not this is debt that indicates growth or financial stress. And as I said, the operator and the spouse's income do appear to be treated differently by the operation. And so there is important policy implications here when we understand how, if we look at policies that are designed to support rural economies, there does seem to be different impacts for farms and for farm households, depending on the kinds of support in a rural economy that is provided. And so to finish off with some next steps, things that I'm really excited to get underway as I get my feet on the ground here at The Ohio State University. I'm really interested in understanding the relationship between off-farm income and government payments and programs. I have a lot of separate work that I did not get to cover today on crop insurance participation. And so understanding the relationship with that, as well as the ad hoc payments, which is of course crucial in this current climate. And also understanding, as I mentioned before, the role that health insurance plays in this decision to work off farm. That's a project that I'm very excited to be working on, as well as, you can't escape it, the relationship between COVID-19 and the impacts it has had on the non-farm economy, how that has affected farms through this particular channel of off-farm income. And so now I'm going to take a deep breath and switch tracks entirely just to talk about a couple things. I see I only have 2 minutes on the clock. A couple of things related to COVID-19 and farm labor demand. And so the first thing I'm going to say is probably not going to come as a surprise to anyone, and that is that the difference in unemployment rate by agricultural subsector differed really markedly as the pandemic started. And so what we see is that those furthest down the supply chain and closest to consumers obviously took the brunt of the impact in terms of unemployment. Processing felt some initial shocks, but nothing, nearly as, nothing nearly as extreme as in the service industry. And actually in terms of production, sort of, you could consider this almost a flat or unchanged, or maybe even slight decrease in unemployment on the farm level. And so this just indicates there's a really important difference in terms of different subsectors. When we drill down into the kinds of labor demanded by this least impacted subsector by production, we see that demand for H-2A labor has been pretty consistent even through the pandemic, and it was mostly fulfilled in terms of positions certified versus positions requested, not an extreme difference there at all. And this can be ascribed mainly to the exceptions that the US government made in terms of border crossing. But of course, we know that H-2A labor is only a sort of, not small, but certainly not the most labor demanded by a farm. And so when we look at arrivals from Mexico overall, including border crossings, we see that they declined 30% between March 2019 and March 2020, which is significant, but it is dwarfed by the decrease in arrivals from Mexico, the change in arrivals from Mexico between April 2019 and April 2020, and we see an almost 90% decline. Of course, this isn't going to capture undocumented workers, which is an entirely separate kettle of fish, as they say, but it shows that there are sort of important signals that farms may be facing labor shortages in the coming year or years. And so to cover a few quickly covers a few more outstanding issues in terms of farm labor. We've seen that the number of H-2A workers has grown over time, and the use of the program has increased, and the government has made changes to improve the efficiency of the program. However, the guidelines have changed very little since the program's inception, and so this is an important area where I think attention might be paid in the coming years, and it would be certainly something that's been looked for by commodity groups and producers. In addition, a question that I've seen come up quite a bit is whether or not farm workers moving around rural counties or moving from place to place to follow the harvest, for example, whether that's contributed to the spread of COVID-19, especially in rural areas. And to date, the research on that has been pretty limited. However, of course, this is an ongoing situation, and that could very well change over time, of course. And then finally, and most importantly, it comes down to the money. And the question remains, how will processors adjust to the increased costs of labor, particularly that this pandemic has caused, from anything from having to incentivize workers to come in despite the health risks, or paying for PPE, or spacing, reducing production, the 6-foot distancing. Those are very important questions that certainly will be something that's going to be addressed throughout the remainder of this year and into next year. And the same questions apply to farms, maybe to a lesser extent. Distancing is easier, et cetera, but there are early indications that there are increased costs for farms as well. So I won't belabor that too much, and I'm really excited to be here, and I thank everyone for your attention and for the warm welcome I've received so far. It's great to be back in the Midwest, and feel free to reach out at any time. The contact information is there, and find me on the website.